In 1989, an act was put in place by the UK government to change the laws in regards to the care of children under the age of 18. This act was put in place to promote and safeguard the welfare of children and to prioritise the wants and needs and rights of children, as well as their safety and the prevention of cruelty to children, especially the wants and needs and safety of children under the care of the local authority. This act gave the right for every child to be protected from abuse and exploitation and to provide a secure and safe environment for all children. But there have been some criticisms of this act, with some believing that although the 1989 Children's Act has been successful in safeguarding and protecting some children, it has also failed to protect others, and that it was not suitable for all children as it took away the rights of carers in children's homes for physically restraining children. This is the story of one such child. This is the story of 15-year-old Gary Morrison. Gary Morrison, born on the 10th of April 1981 in Birmingham, UK. He lived at home with his parents and 3 older brothers and younger sister in the Hockley area of Birmingham. Gary's parents were always at work, so couldn't keep an eye on him as much as they would have liked to, and at age 8, Gary was out of control. Gary was sent to a special school and regularly played truant, and at age 9, he'd been accused of inappropriately touching girls. Gary eventually caught the attention of social services when he was caught shoplifting twice and also caught wandering the streets late at night. At age 9, Gary went into voluntary care at the weekends and during holidays, but he was still out of control and it was getting progressively worse. By age 10, his school suggested that Gary go into voluntary care with social services, saying that he'd be safer in their care than at home, which his parents agreed to. Gary was moved to 3 different homes at the age of 10 until a first order was sought by the courts to lock him into a secure accommodation for children with behavioural problems. A secure order is where the local authority can hold children in secure accommodation when the court agrees that they represent a significant danger to themselves or others. Richard Evans, then director of Birmingham Social Services, said, "We had been in contact with Gary since he was 9 and he was out of control then. The only way we could really control him was to lock him up." By age 12, in 1993, Gary was involved in what police described as a stabbing incident, and at age 13, Gary was arrested for possession of a replica firearm. 3 days after this, Gary was again accused of inappropriately touching girls. When Gary turned 14, 9 days after his 14th birthday, on the 19th of April 1996, his secure order expired, and the authorities then had no grounds to hold him at Glenthorne Youth Treatment Centre in the Erdington area of Birmingham. Glenthorne Youth Treatment Centre was a high-security home for troubled children where staff had the power to restrain children if necessary. But due to the expiry of Gary's secure order and the fact that staff had noted an improvement in Gary's behaviour, a High Court order agreed that he should no longer be in a secure home, and Gary was then moved to a children's home, St John's, which was in Gravelly Hill, Erdington. Due to the fact that St John's was not a secure unit, under the rules of the Children's Act 1989, staff at this new accommodation had no powers to restrain Gary, and staff said that the day Gary knew his secure order had expired was when his behaviour changed again for the worse. Staff at the St John's Children's Home said that Gary started smoking cannabis in his room, which was also found in his room. but nothing was done about it. Gary began staying out late and mixing with the criminal culture, but again, nothing was done about it, as staff claim that under the guidelines of the 1989 Children's Act, they were powerless to stop him. The staff also failed to inquire about where Gary was going when he went out and who he was associating with, and if they were even suitable friends. Gary began going missing and absconding from the children's home on 18 different occasions. He was also caught with a knife and was arrested for street robberies. Gary would leave the children's home at will whenever he felt like it, and no one would know where he was. And other than compile a 7-year list of Gary's crimes, social services did nothing more. It was also noted that Gary often had large amounts of cash in his possession that was not given to him by the children's home, and staff at the children's home said that it was usual for Gary to have between £50 to £100 on him at any one time, and no one knew where the money was coming from. Gary also had designer clothes that the children's home did not buy him, but yet staff asked no questions. By now, Gary was said to be so out of control that he had not been to the on-site school he was supposed to attend at all, and most of the time, staff didn't know where he was. Gary was also said to have been aggressive towards staff. During his time under the care of the local authorities, an estimated £350,000 was spent on caring for Gary and trying to rehabilitate him, and he was said to have committed no fewer than 189 offences. By then, he had moved from Glenthorne Treatment Centre and Secure Unit and been at St John's Children's Home for just 5 weeks. On Sunday the 19th of May 1996, just over 1 month after Gary's 15th birthday, after what was described as a heated discussion with staff, Gary was allowed to leave to go and visit his parents in Hockley, on the condition that he be back at the children's home for 10 p.m. that day. So Gary left the home. As Gary walked down Gravelly Hill, which was the road the children's home was on, he walked to a nearby car hire place called Kennings Hire, which was also on Gravelly Hill, and he stole an Enreg Silver Rover Metro car. Gary continued on in the stolen vehicle, intent on making his way to his parents' house in Hockley. But it had been raining that day, and the roads were said to be slippery. At approximately 11 a.m, Gary, who had not been wearing a seatbelt, skidded on Ox Hill Road in Handsworth on the junction near to Rookery Road and crashed into a tree, where he was crushed between the tree trunk and a garden wall, where he sustained multiple injuries and died on impact due to chest injuries. Paramedics were called, as well as the fire services, who removed the roof off the top of the car in order to try to save Gary's life. But once the roof had been removed from the car, it was already too late, as Gary, who was just 15 years old, had already died on impact. At Gary's post-mortem, samples of his blood that were taken revealed cannabis in his system, which the coroner said had been in his system within an hour before his death. Gary's older brother, then 25-year-old Lloyd Morrison, who described his younger brother, Gary, as a bad boy, but loving, tactile, boisterous, and said that Gary liked his own way, said that the family was devastated and that Gary was not as bad as people made out. Lloyd also said that the family were not happy with the amount of freedom Gary was allowed whilst in care, and that they did not expect for Gary to be allowed to go out onto the streets on his own. The family also expressed their anger at the fact that Gary was basically left to do whatever he liked, despite social services saying that he'd be safer in care than at home, and the family were going to be making official complaints to the Ombudsman as well as seeking legal action. staff at the St John's Children's Home stated that due to the Children's Act 1989, the physical restraint of children was no longer allowed, so they could not control Gary or stop him from leaving if he really wanted to. The staff were also in fear that they would be disciplined if they tried to physically stop a child from leaving the children's home, as the Children's Act of 1989 had put a stop to physically restraining children in order to protect them from abuse by adults and to give children their rights. So basically their hands were tied, allowing kids to do whatever they felt like. The coroner, Richard Whittington, classified Gary's death as death by misadventure, and also criticised the 1989 Children's Act, saying that the way it operated at the moment was too liberal and unsuitable for exceptional children like Gary, and Gary was not given the discipline he needed. Whilst Bill Baldwin, former head of education at St John's Children's Home between 1972 and 1992, blamed politically correct local authority policy, saying that it's because physically controlling disruptive and disobedient youngsters was effectively abandoned. We are now reaping the consequences of a massive social experiment that has been conducted over the past decade or more. Gary's funeral took place on Friday the 31st of May, 1996. The Bridge Childcare Development Service carried out an independent inquiry into Gary's death and absolved social services of all blame, but said that risk could have been minimised if the new recommendations that they now have since Gary's death were in place at the time, such as questioning Gary on the lucrative criminal culture he was moving in by asking him where he was getting his money and designer clothes from. A former staff member at St John's Children's Home who did not want to be identified stated that St John's Children's Home was poorly managed and run centred on a lack of control of children, and that many staff were unqualified and no training were given despite housing some of the most difficult children in Birmingham. Children were taken from their families by magistrates because they were out of control, but at St John's, staff had no control over the children either because of social workers afraid of being accused of abuse, so children were allowed to do whatever they wanted. Staff knew that children were leaving the home to commit crime, and girls in their care in the home, some as young as 12, were going out prostituting, selling their bodies for as little as £10 or up to £25. But again, due to the fear of being accused of abuse or interfering with the child's rights at the risk of losing their jobs, staff were being told that it was up to the children's self-determination if that's what the child wants to do. It became politically incorrect to encroach on the rights of children, and if the staff did try to physically stop the children from leaving the children's home by holding onto the child's clothes, or by holding the child's arms against the sides of their bodies, or by holding the child in a bear hug, or putting the child on the ground, then the child could make an allegation against them and an immediate investigation would be launched against the staff, involving senior management, social workers and or the police. The former staff member said it was a regime of fear of being sued. The former staff member also said that St John's Children's Home was a training school for crime, where children at the home got involved in crimes such as stealing cars, robberies, muggings, burglaries, drug dealing, with marijuana being the drug most frequently available, and he also claimed that solvent abuse was rife. The former staff member said the children from the home would often hang around the city centre and brought alcohol into the children's home as well as drugs and weapons, but the staff were unable to search them when they came back because under the powers of the Children's Act 1989, the staff's powers were limited under what they could or could not do, and it was argued that St John's Children's Home should be a home from home, and that staff wouldn't search their own kids when they came in, so why should they be allowed to search the children in the children's home? Another staff member said that legislation was set out by the government to give children power, and kids knew this and knew how to work the system. Gary Morrison was the third child under the care of social services and living at St John's Children's Home to die in a stolen car in 6 years. And due to the heavy criticisms and public scrutiny, St John's Children's Home was shut down for good 1 year after the death of Gary, and turned into Kingsmere Remand Unit in 2000 as a remand centre for children waiting to be sentenced by the courts. Kingsmere Remand Unit closed in 2010 and is now Birmingham City Council Youth Offending Service.